Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our conversation with local authors Tessa Wegert and Wendy Walker. My name is Paige Berger, and I'm the marketing director here at Barrett Bookstore in Darien, and along with my colleague, event coordinator Rosanna Nissen, and the wonderful Darien Library, who are co-sponsoring this event, it's our pleasure to welcome you here this evening. I'm going to launch into introductions in a brief moment, but I did want to introduce Crowdcast to those of you who have not used it before. We have a chat on the side of your screen, and you're welcome to throw comments in there. The authors are also going to take questions about midway through the program. And if you look at the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Ask a Question, and you can throw your questions in there at any point during the chat, and they'll get to as many as they can. We can't see you, so feel free to grab a drink and put up your feet and relax. And that's it in terms of housekeeping. So on to the real reason you are here. We're delighted to be gathered here tonight to celebrate Tessa's new book, The Dead Season, which just came out today. Today is publication day, and we do have signed copies in the store. And we are so grateful to Wendy, who also has a very new book out. And we're so grateful, Wendy, that you agreed to talk with Tessa on her publication day. Thank you. Tessa is a Canadian expat, journalist, and former digital media strategist. Her business and marketing articles have appeared in such publications as Forbes, the Huffington Post, Adweek, and The Economist. She attended Concordia University in Montreal, where she studied communications. The Dead Season is Tessa's second novel, her first, Death in the Family, which we loved celebrating in person in February, came out earlier this year. Tessa's conversation partner tonight is no stranger to any of you, I'm sure, Wendy Walker, the author of the psychological suspense novels All Is Not Forgotten, Emma in the Night Before, and again, Don't Look for Me. Her novels have been translated into 23 foreign languages and topped bestseller lists both nationally and abroad. They've been selected by Reese Witherspoon, The Today Show, and the Book of the Month Club, and optioned for television and film. Wendy holds degrees from Brown and Georgetown Law School and has worked in finance and several areas of the law. A former family law attorney with training in child advocacy, Wendy draws from her knowledge of trauma and psychology to write compelling and complex characters and stories. Ladies, they are not here to see me, so I'm going to disappear. Have fun, and thank you both again.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Tessa.
Hello. Thank you everyone for coming.
Oh my gosh, this is such an exciting day. Pub Day is like, what you've been waiting for. And for those of you who aren't local and don't know us, we actually live one town apart. And we had the good fortune of meeting last year. And I think we actually met in person the day before everything shut down. You were reminding me of that when we were prepping for this event. And I remember going into the restaurant with my hand sanitizer, and we weren't really sure what we were supposed to be doing. And I'm so glad we got to have that time to to really chat and get to know each other. And what I found so fascinating about that conversation, because I really didn't know much about you, we really hadn't met before, was that we had these sort of similar stories of this long walk to finally, getting published. So I'm sure people would love to hear how you became the author of these amazing sort of Agatha Christie / psychological suspense novels that are just, so good. So tell us your story.
Yeah, sure. Well, let's see. So I've been writing, as I think many authors will tell a similar story. I've been writing ever since I was a kid. I did short stories and poems and entered contests and all of that stuff. But it wasn't until my kids were about 9 months old and 2 years old, and I was still working as a freelance journalist. And I just felt like I needed some kind of creative outlet. And, when you have a young family like that, they take up so much of your time and energy, which was great. And I was loving it. But there was just some kind of, creative feeling that I was missing. And that was why I decided to try to write a novel to begin with. And this was about 10 years or so ago. So I wrote a thriller over the course of about a year, and that turned into another thriller and another thriller. And eventually I got an agent, and, over the years worked my way to getting this initial book deal. And initially I was writing thrillers that were kind of along the lines of Michael Crichton, a bit of an adventure, kind of somewhat techno thriller. And then at some point just thought, well, my favorite genre is mystery. I've never really tried to write a true mystery. I'll give it a shot. I'll work in all my favorite components of mystery stories, the golden age era of detective fiction, all that stuff that I loved, Clue and Agatha Christie. So that was how Death in the Family, the first book in the series, came to be. And then that released in February, and it was my good fortune to have a 2-book deal. So now the second book is out much more quickly than I was expecting it to be. It was initially slated to release in February of 2021. And then Berkeley pushed up the date, I think in part because it takes place in the winter. And so to have it come out right before the holidays made a lot of sense. It has this, very wintry looking cover. So yeah, so it's funny because, after waiting all these years for something to happen and feeling like I was just kind of in my own little isolated box, sitting at my computer and not really exposed to anything that was happening in the publishing industry, and just trying to work my way into it somehow, trying to find that little, cranny. I now have these 2 books out in the same year, which kind of seems like some kind of miracle, frankly. And I know your experience is similar to some extent, right, Wendy?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. I had the same thing. I had, my son was 9 months old. I decided to be a stay-home mom and take time off from practicing law. And I decided that I would write novels. I think I must have always wanted to. It must have been in me all along, because of all the things when you're sitting there giving yourself permission to try something new that doesn't have to have a direct path to success, which is that's all I'd done my whole life. It was, investment banking. Okay, I'm going to study these classes, and then I'm going to go to these information sessions and have my resume and, go through all everything I'd done. Law school, you become a lawyer. There was a set path, right? That you didn't know 100% where you would end up, but there was a path to achieving that goal. And this was the first time that I said, I have a few years to sort of play with and try to do something that doesn't have this direct path. And I had no idea how indirect the path actually was. And I have to say, I don't know that I would have had the courage if someone told me it was going to take me 17 years to become I got published first in 2008. So that was more like 9 years from start to getting published. But my first 2 books were in general fiction. They didn't sell well. They definitely were not career making. So 17 years to become a fully employed, self-sustaining, author. So that's a long, long journey. And like you, I have a lot of I call them drawer novels, because back in the day, I used to print them out and then they would go in a drawer. Now they're disc novels. I don't know. But a long journey. And just like you, it was being in the right place at the right time, having an agent, who advised me of what was really selling, having then sort of done family law in between, and having the skills to write the novel that was, being sought after in the market, and also, really loving that genre. Just you can't map that out. So for all the writers out there, I wish, I'm sure we would love to give you a direct path to success, but there just isn't one. But let's talk about Shanna Merchant. So now, do you pronounce it Shanna or Shana?
I pronounce it Shana, only because in my head, she's got that Tim uses this nickname Shane for her. So right from the start, I always considered her more, Shayna than Shanna, but you could go either way.
Yeah, that's good. So Shayna Merchant, how did you come up with the character? How did you, like, when you decided you were going to go more with this sort of Agatha Christie whodunit vibe in Death in the Family, which was the first in the series? How did you come up with Shayna Merchant? And tell everyone your connection to the Thousand Islands, because it's such a cool setting for that book.
Yeah. Oh, well, yeah. I mean, so the way it all started was, as I said, I really wanted to try to write somewhat of a traditional murder mystery detective fiction story, but then give it a contemporary twist. So it was at this point where my kids were really into the board game Clue. So I knew I wanted to have, some of those vibes to it. And then I'm such an Agatha Christie fan too. And I love Louise Penny and Tana French and all of these novelists that have strong detective characters. And Tana French definitely has some female detective characters, but you don't see them, or at least several years ago when I started writing this book, I hadn't come across all that many. So I wanted to create a female protagonist that had some of those components or some of those characteristics that were similar to Poirot or Inspector Gamache from the Louise Penny stories, like somebody who was very strategic about the way that they approached their cases, very thoughtful about analyzing characters and the suspects and looking for clues where maybe others wouldn't necessarily spot them. So I wove that all into the Shayna character. And then I needed her to have a vulnerable side too. So then I gave her this kind of traumatic backstory. For those who haven't read Death in the Family and don't know about that backstory, she and this isn't giving anything away. This becomes known very early in Death in the Family, but she was abducted while working in New York City with the NYPD as a detective by a man who she knows, all she really knows about him is that they share a hometown, the hometown of Swanton, Vermont. So she has moved to the Thousand Islands at the beginning of Death in the Family to escape that traumatic experience. He has since escaped and he's on the lam, and she very much wants to find him and find out why, when he murdered other women, why did he hold her captive for so many days and not actually harm her? So there's this unresolved conflict with him, and that kind of follows her wherever she goes. So she is struggling with PTSD. She is thrown into this new case in Death in the Family, and then another case, actually 2 cases in the Dead season. And she's still, throughout all of this, all of her investigative work, very much trying to get over the psychological trauma of having been, held captive, and then still being so fixated on finding this man, this monster, and having no idea really how to go about doing that. Should she try to lure him to her? Maybe he's already, there. Maybe he's following her around. She just doesn't really know.
Yeah, and I have to say, when I read the first chapter of Death in the Family, you never know what you're going to get, right? So you get a book from another author, and I really didn't know much about it. And I just loved how edgy she was. And that first twist when you learn that this thing happened. And I was like, oh yes, she's going to be like struggling and tortured and full of anxiety and issues. And I was so excited because that's my world. I mean, those are the books that I write. Those are the books.
Yeah.
So when you go, it's so interesting how in the world of suspense, and there are so many little subcategories, and they're very nuanced, and the boundaries aren't quite clear, but there definitely is a vibe to like a dark psychological thriller, and then you can go all the way to like a really lighter sort of whodunit where there's really no bad language, and the characters, nobody's too bad. Yes, there's murder, but it's, and then you can go all the way to the cozies, right? To the cozy. Right. So there's like a huge range in between. And when I read that first chapter, I really was so excited because I love that sweet spot of having an edgy character who has been through something and is a little bit tortured and is struggling, because I don't know, I just do. It's what I write. It's where my sort of my interests lie. It's where my training came from when I started writing these thrillers. So, but how did you, so when you were thinking about her and coming up with this backstory, which gets further developed in the Dead season, right? So
yeah, definitely.
When you first thought her up and you knew that she was going to have this thing that happened in New York and that she was still struggling with the PTSD from that, did you have her whole backstory that shows up in this next book already mapped out? When and how did you come up with that?
So actually, I initially wrote Death in the Family as a standalone. I didn't picture it as a series at all. So things were pretty much wrapped up in my initial, the final draft of it that my agent saw and that the editor saw and that went out on submission. It was just written as a standalone. I knew right from the very beginning in writing Death in the Family who I wanted Blake Bram, who is the serial killer that she's hunting down. I knew who I wanted him to be to her and what that relationship would be. But I intended to wrap it all up in the first book, which of course would have been a very different book. But when Berkeley, my publisher, said, well, what do you think? Would you be willing to try to make it into a series? I, of course, said yes, because why would you say no? So then I ended up taking, the last third of the first story of Death in the Family, and that became the beginning of the Dead season. So everything from there on, no, I didn't know initially what I wanted that backstory to be. I didn't necessarily know how I was going to develop it. I knew there needed to be, once I really got into the nitty gritty of it, I knew there needed to be two cases in the second story because part of it takes place in her hometown of Swanton and the rest of it is in the Thousand Islands, which is her new home. So she needed to kind of be ping-ponging back and forth between those two settings. And there needed to be a reason for that, obviously, just from a logistical standpoint. So there's the case that brings her to Vermont, which is that she learns that her estranged uncle, who kind of disappeared 20 years or so ago, has been found, his remains have been found, and it appears to be murder. And she goes back to Swanton to comfort her family. And while she's there, realizes that it's possible that her family might be involved in this murder or might know something more about it than they're letting on. So because she's an investigator, she can't resist poking around and trying to collaborate a bit with the local police force who are working on the case. And then while she's there, she finds out that there is a missing child, an abduction case that has occurred back home in the Thousand Islands. And she needs to go back and help with that as well, even though she's actually technically on probation and suspended and working through her PTSD and in therapy. She just can't stay away from it. She knows that there's some connection there, something that's personal to her, some connection to the man that she's searching for.
Yeah, I love how you bring in her family and her hometown, and then bring us, back and forth between the two places, because it just adds another layer of intrigue, and it makes it even more atmospheric. And the small town feel, the Thousand Islands has like that. It's not really a small town feel. It's like a wilderness feel. And I went there as a small child, actually, and I still remember it. And I remember it was my grandmother's friend. We went to visit, and I remember, for those of you who haven't been there, some of the houses take up like an entire island, the entire little island, and they're just like floating houses with a dock. And I remember jumping out of a second floor window with the kids that lived there into the water. And it was that's how deep it was. And you could jump out of the window, and it was like jumping off a cliff into deep lake water. And so it's not so much small town as it is like hidden and eerie and beautiful, but also a wilderness kind of feel to it, right? Then the town in Vermont, though, has that traditional like small town feel to it that is a whole different, just gives it a whole different feel. And it's really, it's like sort of eerie, and there are secrets there in addition.
Who do you trust? Yeah.
everybody knows everybody's business. So her family is still there, and the secrets are still there, and she's, trying to unearth them.
Yeah, I love stories like that. And that plays so much into what, several of your books, but definitely Don't Look for Me. And that's that small town, the mystery of knowing that something could be happening kind of below the surface.
Yeah.
And you think people so well, when in fact everyone has their secrets and everyone might be holding something back. That I've always found that so intriguing. I really gravitate, as a reader, I really gravitate towards stories like that.
Yeah, and there's something, this was the first book where the town really, of mine, where the location really became almost a character in the book.
Yeah.
The other ones provided a setting that gave sort of more support to the character's motivations, like a wealthy suburb, or, the sort of competitiveness over money or appearances and that kind of feel. But this was the first time that I really found the town taking on, a main role in the story. And it was so much fun because you could just have everybody know everybody, and anything can happen. You can bring outsiders in, you can have people disappear, you can have there's so much you can do with it. But visually, I think it really works to bring the reader close into your story. So I think it's really well done. And so tell us about your process and how did you go about writing? It took you all those years to write Death in the Family, and then how long did it take you to write The Dead Season? And how did you structure your life with your kids? And did you write any of it during COVID? And what was the process of getting this book done?
So that's something that I think most authors would agree, and probably Wendy, you do too, that it's a bit of a shock when you get a book contract and now you have a hard and fast deadline and somebody is expecting a deliverable and you can't just take your time with it. The way I did before, I would write whenever I had a chance. I didn't, set aside a certain amount of time every day to get it done. I definitely do that now. So I had basically a year to write The Dead Season, a little less than a year. And I outlined it very thoroughly, which is something that I hadn't done until I wrote Death in the Family. But once you start writing a mystery, at least for me, it was critical to outline to that extent because I just didn't want to write myself into a corner. I wanted to make sure that I knew where things were going, because going back, especially when you're doing a mystery, going back and retroactively planting those red herrings and clues, that involves a lot of rewriting, which takes a lot of time. So I knew I didn't have that much time with the second book, and I ended up outlining it. And it just, it was easier to some extent than writing Death in the Family, maybe because it was my second mystery, but I think also because the characters were so defined for me in my mind at that point. In the first story, I was still really getting to know them and determining who they were and what their motivations were. And I knew all that so clearly when I got to The Dead Season that all I had to do was really follow along with their journey, because I knew where they each needed to go and what would make sense for them individually. And then, how I could potentially make that into a cohesive story.
It's so interesting that you outline, because I outline meticulously, and it's always one or the other. And that's why we have these conversations on panels at writing festivals about whether you're a plotter or a pantser, which
it's so polarizing, isn't it?
It's like, but the funny thing is that people really are one or the other. Yeah. And people who are what they call pantsers, because they fly by the seat of their pants. And I didn't make up that expression, by the way. So I find it a little bit odd, and I'm glad I'm not one, because anyway, but I have a lot of friends who are pantsers, and I just don't get it. And when they describe their process to me, just like you said, I feel like when I'm trying to create a story that has twists and turns, and especially a big twist, which is something that when you get into the psychological suspense, readers are kind of expecting that, and not so much like a whodunit, but they want that big that big twist, and they want it to be either, you know, because you've shifted timelines, or you've written in a few different, you know, with a few different narrators, and one of them isn't who they think it is, or it's a, you know, like they want something
payoff, right?
On a big twist. But they, you know, and Don't Look for Me is really the first book. It has a big twist at the end, but it's not a tricky twist. It's not a manipulative, you know, traditional psychological thriller twist. It is more of a whodunit than I've ever written before. And doing that, it requires, like you said, you have to plant all of the clues in the right order, or they will either stand out too much and the reader's subconscious brain will say, aha, you know, like, why is she talking
for that guy? Yeah.
Why is she talking about the plumber when she's at the grocery store? You know, like, you gotta know that she can only think about the plumber when she's at the sink, like that kind of thing. You have to be so meticulous because the readers are savvy. Like, the readers in our genre are voracious and they read so much, and part of the fun is trying to guess all of our tricky twists and all of our red herrings and misdirections. But the true pleasure is when they can't guess. And so it's like this push-pull. And, you know, you'll always have readers who say that they got your twist. And then you'll always have readers who didn't get any of them. And then you'll have a wide range in between. And you try to just, you know, you're not going to get everybody with your twist. And if you do, then there are going to be some people, I think, who say it wasn't fair, right? If you make it so deceptive that nobody gets it, there are going to be people who feel like it really wasn't fair, that you didn't give enough clues. There's you have to, I think, for me, I would have such an anxiety attack if I tried to write like that kind of book without plotting.
Me too. And it affects pacing so much too, because you need to think in it, at least I feel you need to think in advance of how you want the story to play out and at what point you need to reveal certain, you know, elements that the reader needs to clue into early on. I mean, it all has to unfold in a certain way in order to keep people engaged, right? Like you're asking, I just read an interview, I think it was quite an old interview, but Lee Child was talking about at some point in the New York Times about how it's all about asking a question and then delaying the answer for the reader. And that's one of the major things that you know, determines what the pacing is going to be like in your story. And with a lot of these detective fiction type of stories, they can be a bit of a slow burn. Definitely Death in the Family, I feel, and I've been told, is more of a slow burn than The Dead Season. The Dead Season, I think, feels a bit more like a thriller, maybe because in the first story, I got so much of the backstory out of the way that now I could kind of hit the ball, you know, hit the ground running with the characters, because I didn't need to explain so much as I did in the first book. But plotting it out really helps with that, don't you think?
Oh my gosh, it's I think it's, for me anyway, I need to do that. And when you were just talking about pacing as well, I feel like the narration structure is also another huge decision that you have to make early on, at least that I have to make early on. And you write these books in first person, in Shayna's voice, and that, you know, that requires it in some ways it's freeing because you're just always in the same voice. Because I've written how many books in that, 2 that are all in with one narrator, and I love it. I love it because you're just in that person's head and you can just be there and you just become that person. But at the same time, you're limited because all of the information that the reader is learning has to come from that person somehow. So you don't have a way of disclosing information to the reader through another narrator that then your other narrator isn't aware of. And that is, for me, that's like my favorite way to ramp up suspense and do that, you know, ask a question and make the reader wonder, is to have 2 narrators. So it affects pacing. How did you decide that you were going to just write in her voice? And have you always written the books that you wrote before these? Did you always write with just one narration? And like, how did you make that decision? Because now you're kind of with it. Like now,
for sure, there's no going back, right? No, I mean, with the thrillers that I used to write, they were third person, and until I got to Death in the Family, I hadn't even really tried this before. I don't think, maybe in a short story somewhere along the way, but it's as you said, I wanted to get into her head, and I wanted the story to be told from her point of view, because it really was her story. It was so much about her journey and her psychological journey to some extent too, and her emotional journey. So, it is a little bit tricky, because jumping back and forth between points of view, it definitely is a great way to build suspense, because as a reader, like if I'm reading a book, I'm really into this one particular character, then all of a sudden I'm taken somewhere else, someone else's story, someone else's point of view. That whole entire time that I'm reading that next chapter, I'm thinking about, when am I going to find out, the question thing, when am I going to find out what's happening over here? How are these two individuals linked? All of that. So you don't get that when you're writing from one particular character's point of view. But I don't know. I mean, I can't picture writing this series any other way. I think it depends on the genre too. Like those other books that I wrote, those were, thriller, action-packed, kind of almost like Jurassic Park type of thrillers, with a huge cast of characters jumping back and forth between storylines, settings, everything. It was almost felt like being in a movie writing those stories, all the different points of view and like different, jumping back and forth between different edits. And with these, it just, I've read a lot of mysteries and police procedurals, not as many cozy mysteries, although I think this has some elements of cozy mysteries too, but I love to be drawn into a character, her own little or his own little individual world, the small town, all of that, and to see everything from one person's point of view. I think you can go a lot deeper, because there's just so much more opportunity to explore what's going on in their head.
I completely agree. And the two books that I wrote with just one narrator were my favorite books to write. They're not necessarily my favorite books that I've written, but they were my favorite books to write, because like you said, you get to do that deep dive into that character, and you can just stay with that character throughout the whole book. But the usefulness of the split narration, is like, it's so hard. I feel addicted to it now, because it's so much fun, because I know what I'm putting the reader through, which is hopefully what they signed up for. But it is something that we have to think about, right? As writers, we have to first think about the plot, then you have to flesh out your characters and really make them either likable or unlikable, but at least somebody that the reader wants to follow and wants to know more about. And then there's the plot, and then all the twists and turns, and figuring out, if you're going to have a big tricky twist, or, I feel like there are so many decisions. Do you ever get writer's block, in the sense of, like, I call it plot block? Like when you're trying to first come up with that book, and you have like the basic concept, and then you're trying to plot it out and not write yourself into a corner and figure out what kind of twists. And I'll have these moments where I'm like, okay, so then maybe why is he chasing her? Okay, maybe he's chasing her because this happened or that happened. And then all of a sudden, I feel like I've figured it out. And then the next day I look at it and I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's crazy. Nobody's going to believe that. That would never happen. And then the next day you come back to it and think, that could happen. Why not? Why couldn't that happen?
Yeah. Sometimes I think you have to write through those just to experience them, right? Just to see if that's plausible and even feasible for the story, or if it can work. I do that a lot. Like I'll write an entire chapter thinking I know exactly what I want it to be, and take a step back and look at it and realize that it's just not going to work, and then pivot and do something different. I guess, you have to be fairly nimble probably to do this kind of writing, because you do need to, everybody wants it to feel authentic and genuine. It shouldn't necessarily, I mean, there is a space for a kind of a more far-fetched story, but with these types of thrillers and mysteries, I think people do want them to seem as realistic as possible, right? You want to imagine it really could happen. So, and I don't necessarily always know in advance when I come up with a plot twist if it's gonna come off that way to readers, right? So I'll just go with it and see if it pans out or not. And then sometimes end up scrapping large chunks of the manuscript, but that's okay. I mean, it's part of the learning experience, and it's part of the journey to get to where you need to go with the story, I guess.
Yeah. And so much of it is selling it, I think, but with the backstory of the characters. And when I was writing Don't Look for Me, I ended up changing the ending. And when I changed the ending, and there's been some controversy about my ending, and
I love the ending of that one.
and like I love talking to book groups because they've read the book, and so there's no spoiler alert.
Talk about it,
and then I can talk about why I decided to change the ending to what I changed it to. But I had to go back then, and sort of like you said, sort of unthread and rethread and tie it all back together, because, but it was worth it. And I've done that with little plot points in other books where I've come up with a better idea or a different idea that, opened up more possibilities, and I've had to go back and rewrite and whatever. But it's such a process, and it takes such a leap of faith to sort of write these types of stories that are taking readers to places that are believable, but are also things that would never happen to them. And I think, one of the most interesting things that I've been hearing from thriller readers and suspense readers throughout COVID is that there's been such a surge in our readership because they are allowing people to feel all of the things that we're feeling in our lives, but we can't do anything about. So we all have fear and anxiety and fight or flight instincts sort of, being revved up inside of us, but we can't do anything about it. In fact, we're told to do the opposite, which is nothing. And by reading a story that sort of brings out fear and anxiety and your heart racing and all of that stuff, but in a little package that has nothing to do with your life.
And then have it be resolved. I never get to experience
the whole process of, and it's like when you cry at a sad movie or a romantic comedy, and the couple gets together in the end, and you tear up, and you have that emotional release of crying at something sad that has nothing to do with your life. It's a cathartic release, and I think bringing these emotions to readers through our books is providing a great community service.
Well, it's escapism for people too, right? I mean, I've heard a lot of people say they had a hard time reading. A friend told me just today she's had a hard time reading during COVID because there are so many distractions. I mean, it's just really hard to sit down and focus on one particular thing. For me, I kind of had the opposite reaction. I don't know. I mean, I just stayed as far away from the news as I could, right or wrong. And then I ended up just reading so much more. So that was a form of escape for me because I, could tune everything else out for a little while and not have to worry so much about things and just focus on what was happening in this one little story. And then, it's resolved, put it away, move on to something else. And especially not being able to travel this year to be able to experience these different settings and locations. It was cathartic, definitely.
No, it's been such an interesting, obviously a really, terrible year in many, many ways. But I think that there's been a newfound sort of love of reading that has come out of it. And it's one of those small silver linings, I think, that I've found as well, has been escaping through books. So with that, we are going to start taking questions because, my gosh, we've been like, talking for 40 minutes. So I'm going to go, okay, let's see if I can do this. Anybody who wants a question, ask a question. Okay, somebody wants to know how you researched the book, what research you had to do.
Oh, well, I mean, 90% of the research that I do is online. And then I read a lot of books about whatever particular subject I'm looking into. And then I had the good fortune before writing, or as I was writing Death in the Family, to connect with Colleen O'Neill, who is the sheriff of Jefferson County. And Jefferson County is where the Thousand Islands are based. That's where the Thousand Islands are set. So she, one day, as I was writing Death in the Family, and I wasn't even very deep into it, I called the sheriff's office, and it was about 5 p.m. And I thought, I'm never going to get anyone. No one's going to talk to me. I don't even have a book deal. I mean, no one's going to pay any attention to my questions. And she happened to pick up the phone, and I explained what I was doing, that I was writing the story set there, and I needed to understand how the local law enforcement worked and what would happen if there was a crime on an island, who would respond? Would it be the Coast Guard? Would it be the New York State Police? And she ended up talking to me for an hour on the phone right there and then, gave me her email address and said, send me questions, anytime you have them. And so we've gone back and forth a number of times, and what has been invaluable as far as making sure that I get that stuff as accurate as possible, because I do want it to come off as realistic. So yeah, that was really lucky. And then in terms of setting, I mean, for the Thousand Islands, I know that area so well. I've been visiting. I think you asked me this question earlier and I didn't even actually answer it. Sorry, Wendy. But I've been visiting that area for about almost 20 years now. My parents-in-law have a place there, so I'm very familiar with it. I go at least once or twice every summer. So I knew that area well. And then that part of the reason why I wanted to set the dead season in Vermont was because I grew up in Quebec, right on the border of Vermont, very close to Swanton. And I had driven through there a bunch of times, spent a lot of time in that area. So, I think not all writers do this, but for me, it's been easier for sure writing about settings that I know really well in terms of developing the atmosphere. People seem to have responded well, especially to the Thousand Islands as a setting, because I don't know that there are all that many books that take place there. And I've always thought that it's a great place to set a mystery. Definitely with, as you said, Wendy, with all these islands, it's really an incredible place, because you do have these little small private islands with just a massive house set on there and not a lot of other property. And, you can only get there by boat for a lot of these islands, and only at certain times of the year, because in the winter, the river freezes over a little bit and you can't necessarily get there. So it had all the trappings of a perfect location for a murder mystery. So the rest of the books, however many more there may be in this series, I don't know that yet, but they'll take place still in the Thousand Islands, because it's just an area that I love so much and know so well. Yeah,
I find writing about places that I know well, especially when you have kids, and this is just a logistical issue, right? When you're, depending on where you are in your life circumstances, but I met a writer once at a speaker series who, was talking about how she researched her book, and she went on a boat and spent, 6 days learning how to free dive so she could write one part of the book.
Wow.
About it. And I thought, oh my gosh, I could never do that. If I want to research a new town, I would have to do a drive-by. I would go up. Maybe I could get away with in one overnight.
Yeah.
But so I tend to write about places that I know well. And I also find that for me, places that I know well, because I'm writing about people and you're writing about people, and at the heart of our stories are people who are influenced by where they grew up. Mm-hmm. That's who I know. If you asked me to have a main character who grew up, in New Zealand, I would not be able to write authentically about that character. I might be able to write a character from New Zealand and do research, but I couldn't get into that character's head psychologically the way that I want to when I'm writing the kind of book that I like to write. And so I end up gravitating towards places that I know because I understand how the place has affected the psychology of my character in a really profound and deep way. And so, to some extent, I think, our research then ends up being, like you said, like with the procedural stuff. With Don't Look for Me, I had to research, how many apple seeds it would take to kill or to,
the cyanide,
harm someone.
Yeah.
And the freakiest thing about it was that it was, of all of my books, which, one of them deals with narcissistic personality disorder, which I knew a little bit about, but also had to do research. And then one with memory science, which required research. I've had to do research, and it was very accessible on the computer. But the apple seeds, there were so much, and it's so varied because it depends on the apple. It depends on how old the apple is, how long it's been on the ground, what you do with the seeds, how you get the insides out, how you ingest it, what else is in your stomach. And people are like obsessed with this topic, like not scientists, but like, I don't know, people. And there was a whole chat room where people were experimenting on themselves, and they were writing in like, today I chewed and swallowed 500 apple seeds of Red Delicious that were, and all I did was vomit. It was crazy. So yes, we end up doing a lot of crazy research. So I want a question. Okay, when you start writing a book, how much push and pull is there between the author and the publisher? Ooh, you're asking us some tricky questions.
Whoa.
Do you continue to think through your decisions and choices? Or do you let the work lie and move on? So that's an interesting question.
It is.
Your editor. Yeah.
Well, I'll answer it, and then I'll let you answer it, Wendy. How about that? Because our experience may be different with that.
Yeah.
So for me, I had a 2-book deal, and so I had no idea what the second book was going to be really when I signed the contract. So I wrote a very extensive outline for the second book, and my editor really felt good about it, and it was approved. I think it probably went to a committee or something, and they approved it. And then as I continued to write it, I realized I wanted to change some things. And there was definitely a moment where I thought, how is this going to work? Am I going to need to get approval for this? What if they don't like my ideas because they signed off on this initial outline? And what if they don't like where this plan is going now? And fortunately, they were okay with all of the changes. And then when it came to the editing process, the way it works is, for me, I sent it to my agent first, and she looked it over and had some suggestions, and then I sent it to my editor. She looked it over, had some suggestions. There weren't any major issues with either book. There weren't any changes that someone wanted to make that I wasn't comfortable with, which was nice. Everybody was very much on the same page with where they wanted things to go. But I will say my agent and editor both have amazing ideas that never would have occurred to me. So there are a couple moments in both books that definitely I wouldn't have come up with if it wasn't for them going, hey, do you think maybe, if you consider this character's motivation, something like this kind of reaction might make more sense, or let's explore this a little bit farther. So that's how it's been for me. And I think it's important to find a team of people that you can connect with that way and collaborate effectively with. Do you agree?
I totally agree. And every one of my books has had a different journey, and I've been with the same editor for all 4. Each one had a different journey. And some was just straight up like, a few changes here and there. One of them ended up rewriting 3/4 of it. Don't Look for Me, she had some great ideas. It was so interesting because I was, again, it's so hard to talk about it without spoilers, but my initial idea for the motivation of the bad person in the book was a very traditional psychological thriller motivation. And we sort of decided to change that. And that was at her suggestion that we change that, and that we take advantage of this small town, and that I had moved my characters for the first time to another location. And so it enabled me to have a completely, to shift my outlook on the whole book. And I was like, oh, wow. Okay. So if I don't have to bring it back home and bring it back to this town where they're from, we're now in another town. It can be all about that town. So instead of, in most like psychological thrillers, you are, things are happening in the place where the characters are, and it's all the family members and it's all the co-workers, and it's, there might be an outsider, but most of it's brought back home. And in this book, it was like just shift turning to the other direction.
Yeah.
Like, oh my gosh, I'm taking characters. It really doesn't even matter where they're from. They are now over here in this place, and it's about these people in this town and what they're up to. And it was such a burst of
the light bulb going off.
And then then ultimately I had to figure it out and figure out what the motivations were going to be. But just that suggestion that what if we make it about the town? What if everything's in the town? And yes, the other characters come into play for sure, but most of the activity and most of the searching goes on in the town. So I think it's sometimes it's so good to have someone else, editors, beta readers, whatever, just to have those fresh ideas, because we can get stuck in a rut. Like you can get stuck in your little, rabbit hole of your book that, that you've been obsessing over for months and months, and to have someone bring you out of your rabbit hole and show you the light, or a different light, can be really nice. I made another question about, other than Agatha Christie and Tana French and Lisa Jewell, who are you reading now? What do you recommend? What are you enjoying? I know that's the worst. Just by the way, for me, I'm always happy to answer that question, but it's so difficult because I feel like we're such a tight community within the thriller suspense space. And we all know each other. We all like blurb each other's books, and we all have books coming out around the same time. We try to cross promote each other's books. And it's so hard to single out one person and one book.
It's like choosing your favorite child.
Yeah, that's exactly what it's like. And I'm like, okay, I hope none of my friends are watching right now.
Yeah. How you doing?
But that said, you're forgiven for your omissions. But what's the latest book that you've read, or are there other genres or other authors that you've enjoyed this recently?
Yeah. So over, the last couple of months, I somehow came across this amazing author named Sarah Stewart Taylor, who's based in Vermont, and she just started a new series, the first book of which came out, I think, over the summer, called The Mountains Wild, about a detective based in Long Island who has family ties to Ireland. So this story involves actually her cousin who disappeared, and she goes to Ireland to try to, follow the trail of her cousin's, her cousin's life after she left Long Island. And I have absolutely recommended that book to so many. I mean, I have lost track I've bought several copies to give as gifts. I mean, it's so good. So that's been fun, because I kind of thought I had a pretty good handle on the writers who were writing stuff that I was really, really into. And then here she came out of nowhere, or maybe I just was totally out of the loop. I don't know, probably.
No, I haven't heard of it. So you'll have to,
it's great. Yeah. And then, I mean, I definitely love Lisa Jewell and Tana French, and oh gosh, there's so many. Samantha Bailey, who's a Canadian author. Woman on the Edge. I really enjoyed. That was her debut.
Yeah, I love it.
Oh gosh, Hannah Mary McKinnon is great, Canadian also. I'm Andrew Piper. I always love, also Canadian. I am Canadian, so I often try to, keep tabs on what's happening in the Canadian literary community too. So he's fantastic, and he writes thrillers and somewhat horror type of novels, but not, too violent or gory or anything like that. I don't know. What about you? I mean, I hate to put you on the spot too with this.
It's interesting because of course, I love all of my friends' books. So, I mean, and I blurb a lot of books.
Including mine, including Death in the Family, which is, I think, initially how we met. Because of exchanging emails, because our editors connected us that way. So
it's great. So for me, like the books that I tend to shout out about are the ones that make me envious of the writing or the plot or something in the book where I think, I just learned something as a writer. I've just now learned something from this book. I find it hard to read in suspense for pure pleasure because I'm always sort of dissecting them and looking for how they're structured, and it's like it feels a little bit like work. But so when I find something that is fresh and new, I get really excited about it. So like The Bright Lands by John Frank, which isn't for everybody. It's got some horror in it. It's a little metaphysical. It's very dark, but it's the structure of it. We were talking about narration. I was reading this book and I was, it's one narrator, then there's another narrator comes in, and then halfway through, one of the characters that has been in the book is suddenly narrating. It's suddenly like the narration is the point of view of that character halfway through the book. And I remember thinking like, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. And then I thought, well, who says you can't do that? Like, that's just something that I know that if I were to think about it, I would be worried that my editor would say, oh, wait, what are you doing? You're confusing people with all these narrations. But the way he did it really worked. And it really taught me something new. And I love Amy Engel, and she just came out with The Familiar Dark, and she's a more literary writer, and her writing is just, the characters are so perfectly drawn, and there's no wasted words about the characters, which I absolutely love when that happens. So those have been two of my favorite reads recently. But I do love all of my thriller friends' books because they are, I mean, they're great. I mean, but for me, it's also, you're also reading them to see what's out there, what's being done, what you need to not do to be repetitive and all of that. So it's a tricky question. And that's it. I think we got to all of them.
Ladies, you guys could go on all night. So we may keep this offline. I'm sad. I have to say, these are the type of events where I'm so sad we don't have a glass of wine and we can't get going. That sounds like a good time to me right now. But what a pleasure. Thank you, Tessa. Congratulations on publication.
Thank you so much.
We have it. Signed copies. Yes.
Party. We'll call them all up.
And Wendy, thank you. So lovely to see you as always. And for those of you who haven't seen the latest, don't look for me. I saw in the chat somebody said it was one of her top.
So good. It's so good. Really good. Yeah.
And thank you also to the Darien Library for helping bring Tessa and Wendy together. If you don't have your copies of the books yet, we've made it very convenient. Bottom of the screen, please support these wonderful authors and their work. And we hope to see you again soon. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.